Welcome back to this course where we are studying different world religions from an academic perspective. So, the academic perspective once again means that we are not here to argue that one religion is better than the other religion, or if following or practicing one religion, how we can achieve a salvation or moksha or liberation. That is not our goal. Here we are simply comparing and looking at some similarities, some differences in different world religions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism of India that originated in India, and Taoism, Confucianism that originated in China, Shinto from Japan, and of course the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, when we look at these religions from academic perspective, we need to look at these religions, how other scholars have studied so far, have tried to study them so far. So, especially in 18th and 19th century, we know that during the colonial times when European powers were ruling several parts of the world, as part of the colonial empire, different scholars from different countries of Europe, they went into Africa and Asia, and they also tried to study different religions of the world, especially in Africa and Asia. In that approach, what happened was that they judged these world religions from their own biases. So, for example, if they were Christians, which most of those researchers were, they looked at religions of Asia, traditions of Asia and Africa, and came to the conclusion that those religions have no, for example, they don't have God, or they don't have scripture, or idea of heaven or salvation. So they were looking at other religions from their own perspective, their own stereotypes and biases. So that happened a lot especially during the colonial times. So how do we avoid those problems when we are looking at religions that are so different from our own, living in Europe and America and or America? When we look at different traditions of the world that are in Asia or Africa, or immigrants who came from Africa, Asia into Americas, how do we look at or try to understand those traditions that are so different from Abrahamic religions? So there are several approaches that we can combine and come to a holistic perspective of these traditions that are different from our own. So we will look at some of these approaches now, and how do we approach these non-Western religions, traditions, cultures that are now no longer non-Western. Actually, they originated in non-Western countries of Asia or Africa, but now they are part of the American society. There are millions of Hindus, millions of Buddhists, millions of Muslims in the Americas. And so, how do we understand those different religions that are right here in our backyard, that are part of our community? So, communities and societies, cities and towns, in the Americas. So there are one problem I already mentioned, what happened during the colonial times. There are other now to solve those problems. There are different approaches to study different religions. One of the approach is called as the evolutionary approach. As you listen to my lecture on this video, you can also follow along the presentation. So if you look at the slide 13, there is something called the evolutionary approach, where different religions are put on some kind of an chronological hierarchy. So scholars thought that the traditions that have the idea of animism were the primitive religions, and then the animism was replaced by idea of God, and this evolution will continue, and finally the different parts of the world, people will accept the idea of monotheism. That was one approach. That's evolutionary approach. Second approach is inspired by Karl Marx. So in this approach, Marxist scholars think that religion is simply, as very famously Marx said, opium of the people. So religion is used by the higher classes of the society to exploit the lower classes of the society, so that the lower classes, the downtrodden, will never challenge the power, will never challenge the higher classes of the society. And so religion can be used to fool them. That is Marxist approach. The next approach on page 15, on the slide 15, is called as the functional approach, in which they say that the scholars that are following functional approach, they say that The religion is simply there to serve the purpose, to serve the function of something else. So religion by itself need not be taken seriously. It is simply there as a means to achieve something else. So, for example, Marxist approach actually that we just studied in the previous slide can be used as an example of functional approach where religion is simply used for socio-economic needs of the higher classes and how they impose their ideas onto the lower classes. Then there is, if you go on slide 17, there is something called psychological approach. Actually, this also can be called as functional approach because here, inspired by Freud, Freudian scholars, using the psychological approach, think that religion is simply, again, some kind of an illusion or even a psychological disease where people need to be given religion or people practice religion as a manifestation of some neurotic disorder that they had in their past. So that's also an example of a functional approach to study religion. My personal or most commonly used approach these days by contemporary scholars is on slide 16, and that is the interpretive approach that is inspired by Clifford Geertz, in which religion is taken seriously on its own. It is not there to serve some other function or purpose, but religion is to be studied from inside out and try to interpret how different practitioners of different religions have used their symbols, their rituals to make sense of their own world in their own terms. So that is the approach that we generally use these days in scholarly world, and we try to take religion on its own terms, not to serve something else. So these are some of the approaches to summarize the evolutionary approach, the Marxist approach, and psychological approach that are examples of the functional approach, and then finally the interpretive approach that is inspired by Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist. So these are different approaches that we use to study different religions of the world. Now, how do we define religion itself? Religion probably can be defined on slide 10, as I summarized there on the slide 10, that it's a set of cultural beliefs and practices that usually include some or all of a basic set of characteristics, including a belief in anthropomorphic supernatural beings such as spirits and gods, a focus on the sacred supernatural, where sacred refers to a feeling of reverence and awe, or the presence of supernatural power or energy that is found in supernatural beings as well as physical beings and objects. So people who practice and follow different religions of the world, they all have basically, most of them anyway, have some kind of a belief or faith in something, some power that is higher than themselves, some gods that is sitting in sky, heaven, some paradise somewhere, or a God that is omnipresent in every different particle of the universe, or also so that God is to be practiced or to be realized by praying to him or her. It could be God or goddesses, gods and goddesses in different traditions, such as in Hinduism, and that divinity is to be practiced, to be connected by different rituals that is common across different religions of the world. So we will take a look at how different religions have used these ideas for thousands of years and how they differ from one religion to the other religion. So that is the broad overview or broad introduction to the idea of study of religion from academic perspective.